What happened to Judy Garland's children is a story of survival through stardom, not just their mothers, but their own. When the world remembers Garland, it sees the ruby slippers, the trembling vibrato, the girl who sang through storms and somehow never stopped smiling. But behind that technicolor myth was a woman who loved her children fiercely, messily, and with every ounce of herself that Hollywood hadn't already taken. Liza Minnelli, Lorna Luft, and Joey Luft didn't just grow up with a famous mother. They grew up with a woman who was trying, often desperately, to stay afloat while raising three children under the crushing weight of her own legend. And somehow each of them emerged, scarred in places, defiant in others, with a version of Judy that only they were ever allowed to keep. Liza was the first to inherit the spotlight. Born in 1946 to Garland and director Vincente Minnelli, she was barely out of diapers when she made her film debut alongside her mother. But Liza didn't wait in Garland's shadow. She ran straight through it. By age 13, she was already dancing with Gene Kelly on television. By 19, she had a Tony. And by her 20s, she had built something that very few celebrity children ever manage, a myth of her own. Winning an Oscar for Cabaret in 1972 wasn't just a career milestone. It was a cultural pivot. People stopped comparing her to her mother and started comparing other performers to her. Her wide eyes, her relentless energy, her barely contained melancholy. These were not borrowed from Judy. They were Liza's own. And yet she never denied the inheritance. In every twitch of her performance, there was a flicker of Garland, the same raw ache, the same need to connect, the same sense that the stage wasn't a choice, but a lifeline. What Liza understood better than anyone was that pain didn't have to destroy you if you could make it sing. While tabloids tried to frame Garland's story as tragic, the overdoses, the marriages, the exhaustion, Liza quietly pushed back. Her mother wasn't a cautionary tale. She was a force, someone who cracked jokes through tears, made strangers feel seen, and turned her fragility into something untouchable. Liza inherited that point of view like armor. When life turned dark, she rewrote it in bright colors. That didn't mean she avoided struggle. Addiction, heartbreak, and illness shadowed her for decades. But like her mother, she kept performing. She stayed visible. She stayed loud. And she stayed in control of her narrative, never begging the public to feel sorry for her, only to listen. If Liza made a career out of reframing the family legend, Lorna Luft made one out of walking straight through it. Born in 1952 to Garland and producer Sid Luft, Lorna was the child of her mother's third marriage and arrived during one of the rare moments when Garland seemed to be regaining control. For a time, their home was vibrant, filled with laughter, late-night singing, and the kind of chaos that doesn't feel chaotic until you're old enough to name it. Lorna was only 11 when she first performed publicly with her mother, singing "Santa Claus is Coming to Town" on the Judy Garland show. She didn't feel like she was stepping into a legacy. She felt like she was just singing with mom, and that's how it always felt, until it didn't. Growing up around Judy Garland meant waking up one night to find Marilyn Monroe sitting on your bed, just making sure you were okay. It meant living in a neighborhood where famous was just another word for family friend. To Lorna, it was normal, until it wasn't. Garland's health and addiction struggles deepened in the 1960s. The money ran dry, the marriages broke down, and in 1969, when Garland died of a barbiturate overdose, Lorna was 16. The childhood ended not with a door slamming, but with a silence that lasted for years. But Lorna didn't retreat. Like her sister, she turned to the stage. She made her Broadway debut in Promises in 1971, then performed in Grease, Guys and Dolls, Gypsy, and countless touring productions. She carved out a space for herself, not because she wanted to be like Judy, but because she wanted to be heard. What she inherited from her mother wasn't just a voice. It was a sense of humor sharp enough to survive anything. And she used it. In interviews and performances, and in her 1998 memoir, Me and My Shadows, Lorna refused to paint her mother as a victim. Yes, Garland had demons, but she also had punchlines. She had joy. She had resilience. And Lorna made it her mission to show that side of her, not just to the world, but to herself. Meanwhile, in the quietest corner of the family's history, Joey Luft was watching everything. Born in 1955, the youngest of Garland's three children, saw his mother through different eyes. While Liza danced and Lorna sang, Joey observed. He didn't chase the spotlight. He didn't need it. His memories were not of stages and ovations, but of softer things. The way Judy smiled when she was relaxed, the way she checked on him at night, the way she laughed when nobody was watching. When she died, he was only 14. And while the public clung to the image of the girl who once sang "Over the Rainbow," Joey quietly buried his mother. For decades, he stayed away from the glare. He studied photography. He worked behind the scenes. He made a life that wasn't defined by who he came from, but by what he could create on his own terms. And when he was ready, decades later, he stepped forward, not to relive the myth, but to tell the truth behind it. In 2014, Joey debuted a one-man show called A Judy Garland Concert with Joey Luft. It wasn't nostalgic, it was corrective. A way to reintroduce the woman behind the icon. Not Dorothy, not the tragedy, but Judy, the mother, the comic, the human being. He didn't care if the audience already knew the Wizard of Oz. He wanted them to know her, because while the world remembered the songs, only her children remembered the silences in between, and those were the parts worth saving. For Liza, the years after Garland's death were not a clean break from the past, but a prolonged negotiation with it. At 23, she was already a Tony winner, a rising star in her own right, but losing her mother, the singular gravitational force in a chaotic childhood, tore open something deeper. Rather than run from the association, she leaned in, dancing on the edge of tribute and defiance. Her Oscar-winning performance in Cabaret just 3 years later didn't feel like the start of something new. It felt like the culmination of something inherited. In Sally Bowles, the chaotic, defiant nightclub singer who covered her heartbreak with sequins and cigarettes, Liza seemed to channel her mother's entire emotional vocabulary. But she didn't imitate Garland. She refracted her. Every gesture, every tear, every twitch of vulnerability came filtered through years of watching Judy perform joy and pain at once. Liza's triumphs were colossal: an EGOT, multiple Tonys, Golden Globes, chart-topping albums. But behind those accolades was the same survival instinct Judy had used to climb her way through Hollywood. Liza knew what it meant to fall apart in public, and she knew how to rebuild. She didn't just inherit Judy's talent, she inherited her resilience, and maybe more importantly, her refusal to let the world write her ending. Even in the spotlight, Liza's humor was often her armor. She learned young that show business was as brutal as it was dazzling, and in every interview, every stage entrance, she projected a kind of joyful defiance, the smile that said, "I'm still here." She had seen too much loss to be naive. Addiction had walked through her front door in childhood. Public failure was always one bad headline away. But Liza never asked for pity. She gave the world performance after performance, insisting not on her legacy, but on her presence. And even when health challenges slowed her pace, the work never truly stopped. She kept showing up, sometimes glamorous, sometimes fragile, always real. Fame had taken pieces of her mother. Liza made sure it never took hers without a fight. Lorna, meanwhile, fought a different kind of battle, one less visible, but no less intense. If Liza stood in the spotlight to claim her own space, Lorna seemed to spend much of her life walking beside it. Her Broadway credits were solid, her television work steady, but for years she lived in the undertow of a double legacy. Judy's myth on one side, Liza's megawatt stardom on the other. In interviews, she acknowledged the weight of that, not with bitterness, but with honesty. Being Garland's daughter came with a story the world was always eager to write for her. But Lorna's own story was far more textured than any headline. She carried her mother's voice in her lungs, but not her mother's chaos. Instead, Lorna built a life out of structure, touring musicals, television appearances, writing, and, eventually, advocacy. Her memoir, Me and My Shadows, did something extraordinary. It refused to flatten Judy Garland into tragedy. Instead, Lorna wrote her as she truly was: brilliant, flawed, hilarious, wounded, radiant, and never just one thing at a time. The book wasn't about settling scores or rewriting history. It was about reclaiming space, for Judy, yes, but also for herself. When the story was adapted into a miniseries in 2001, it brought a new generation into the Garland legacy, not through glitz, but through grit. That same year, Lorna was diagnosed with breast cancer. True to form, she spoke about it publicly, directly, with the same unflinching tone she had used to describe her mother's breakdowns or her own brushes with darkness. There was always pain, but there was always a punchline too. That was something all three siblings shared: a refusal to drown in sentiment. Judy Garland may have been the world's greatest entertainer, but to her kids, she was also the woman who cracked jokes in the darkest rooms. Joey, ever the quiet one, kept showing up in smaller, quieter ways. His one-man show in 2014 wasn't a comeback. It was a confession. At 59, he didn't try to perform his mother's songs or wrap himself in her image. He told stories. Some were funny, some were tender. All of them were his. He talked about the side of Garland that didn't make the gossip columns: her silliness, her warmth, her way of checking in on people when no one else did. For a man who had spent most of his life behind the camera, the show was less about being seen and more about setting the record straight. Joey didn't chase audiences. He welcomed them into a version of history that hadn't been rewritten by studios or tabloids. His show wasn't a tribute, it was a reunion. Just him and his mother, one last time, in front of a room full of strangers who finally got to meet her as he had. Even today, Joey stays out of the headlines. No memoir, no red carpet tours, no dramatic tell-alls. And yet, his role in preserving Garland's legacy may be the most quietly essential of all. While Liza brought her mother's electricity into the modern era, and Lorna gave language to the pain that fame often hides, Joey preserved the soul of Judy. Not in glitter, but in memory. Each sibling chose their path deliberately, not in reaction to who their mother was, but in recognition of everything she had survived to give them. They didn't become legends because of her. They became whole in spite of what her legend cost them. As they grew older, that truth became sharper. Not every child of fame finds clarity. Many collapse under the weight of unfinished business. But Liza, Lorna, and Joey did something rare. They kept what was good, let go of what wasn't, and stood together through it all. They carried not just Judy's name, but her contradictions, her madness and magic, her light and loneliness. And they never let the world forget that she was more than a voice on a record. She was their mother, and she was unforgettable. In the years that followed, the world never stopped circling back to Judy Garland. Biopics were made, musicals revived, tribute albums recorded. Every generation seemed to rediscover the Wizard of Oz, then go digging for the darker truth behind the girl who followed the yellow brick road. But her children never needed reminders. For Liza, Lorna, and Joey, Judy was never just a myth. She was a presence, messy, brilliant, human, whose fingerprints were still on their lives, even decades after her voice went quiet. The public remembered the overdose, the tragedy, the 5 marriages. Her children remembered how she used to sing through the house when she cooked, how she made people laugh until they cried, how she'd sit on the floor with them at night and talk like the world outside didn't exist. That was the version they carried. And as time passed, they found ways, separate but equal, to pass it on. Liza, the most visible of the three, remained a fixture in American culture. Even as her health made appearances more selective, her status as a living icon only solidified. Tributes to her mother were woven into her own tributes. A song here, a story there, a look in the eye that said, "She's still with me." When Judy Garland was posthumously honored, whether at award shows or film retrospectives, it was Liza who often stood at the microphone, not to rewrite the story, but to finish it. Not with sadness, but with pride. And her own presence in the room always carried more than celebrity. it carried lineage. You could hear Judy in the way Liza hit certain notes, see her in the tilt of a smile, feel her in the silence between the lines. For Liza, performing wasn't a way to escape her mother's shadow. It was a way to speak with her again. Lorna's mission deepened with time. After publishing her memoir, she continued to perform, lecture, and advocate, not just for her mother's memory, but for mental health, addiction recovery, and the long-term effects of growing up in chaos. In her later performances, she didn't shy away from the weight of the name she carried. Instead, she used it as a platform, not to elevate herself, but to spotlight the complexities of fame that most audiences never see. When she attended a screening of Wicked decades after Judy's death, it wasn't nostalgia that moved her. It was continuity. To Lorna, the story wasn't about witches or emerald cities. It was about women who were misunderstood, judged, and sometimes destroyed by forces larger than themselves. She understood that story. She'd lived it, and she had survived it, not by pretending it hadn't hurt, but by choosing to laugh anyway. Joey, ever the private sibling, kept his appearances rare but meaningful. Every few years he would emerge, not to promote, but to preserve. He spoke not in sound bites, but in full paragraphs. His memories weren't packaged for television. They were lived, personal, and sometimes heartbreakingly quiet. In one of his rare public reflections, he insisted that people didn't really know Judy, not the real Judy, not the woman who was funny and thoughtful and deeply empathetic. That was the Judy he wanted to share. And in doing so, he positioned himself not as a curator of fame, but as a steward of truth. He didn't perform, he bore witness. And that role, though quieter than his sisters, was no less vital. Without Joey, the version of Garland we remember might have remained two-dimensional, a cautionary tale wrapped in glamour. Because of him, she remains human. Today, the three children Garland left behind have become elders in their own right. They've survived not just their mother's legacy, but the machine that built it, the industry that praised her, consumed her, then mourned her publicly while moving on privately. Her children refused to move on in silence. They built lives, full, complicated, extraordinary lives, around the shape of her absence. They never tried to be her, but they carried her in everything, in their talent, their humor, their cracks, and their persistence. That was always the thing about Garland. No matter how many times the world tried to flatten her into a headline, she got back up. She sang. She cracked jokes. She made dinner. She held her children. And in those final years, as her health declined and her world narrowed, it was those children, not the studio bosses, not the critics, who saw her most clearly. Judy Garland died at 47, long before she had the chance to watch her children become who they are now. She never saw Liza win her Oscar, or Lorna stand in front of a packed theater and tell their story, or Joey bring her back to life through memory. But what she gave them, more than fame, more than talent, was the will to keep going, to laugh in the middle of heartbreak, to turn pain into art, to turn silence into song. And in doing so, they didn't just protect her legacy, they completed it. In every step they took toward the light, they pulled her a little further out of the darkness. Because in the end, the story of Judy Garland isn't just about the woman who sang over the rainbow. It's about the people she left behind and how they found their way back. Not through magic, not through myth, but through memory, music, and the stubborn, shining truth that even the brightest stars don't disappear. They just leave echoes. And in the voices of Liza, Lorna, and Joey, those echoes have never stopped singing. If you found this breakdown powerful and want more deep dives into the hidden lives of Hollywood's forgotten children, subscribe to Legacy Uncovered. Your support brings these invisible stories to light. Thanks for listening.